It's an institutional imperative. By imperative, I don't say it's a law of nature, you can change it, but given the way institutions now function, one critical element is that the decision makers, the core decision makers in the economy and the society, and therefore indirectly in the political system, their core goal is to essentially maximize short-term profit and power. And that leads almost directly to destruction of the environment.
That's Noam Chomsky, and this is Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. This edition of AR features Noam Chomsky on unconventional wisdom, part 2 of a special 2-part program. A well-functioning propaganda system is barely noticeable. Almost by osmosis, it induces among citizens an inability to deconstruct arguments and to think critically. What to do in such circumstances? Bob Marley advises, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, as he sings in his classic Redemption song. Someone who has dedicated himself to assist in that emancipation is Noam Chomsky, the legendary MIT professor. He's been a leading voice for peace and social justice for more than 40 years. Edward Said called him one of the most significant challengers of unjust power and delusions. He goes against every assumption about American altruism and humanitarianism. Noam Chomsky is the author of scores of books, including Hopes and Prospects, and a collection of interviews I did with him, How the World Works. We continued our conversation on unconventional wisdom in his office at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The cover of Z Magazine, January 2012, has a quote from you. Any good capitalist democracy needs to keep the rabble in line, to make sure that they are atoms of consumption, obedient tools of production, isolated from one another, lacking any concept of a decent human life. They are to be spectators in a political system run by elites, blaming each other and themselves for what's wrong. Now, you said that before the Occupy Wall Street movement took root.
Not only that, years before. And in fact, most of that is quotes. I don't know if they had quotation marks about it. Most of it's quotes from the business literature and leading progressive intellectuals. A number of those quotes are from Walter Lippmann, who they didn't use sometimes exactly those words.
That spectators, for example.
Spectators, not participants, have to be kept in line. We have to, as he put it, protect ourselves from the ignorant and meddling outsiders. We have to be protected, that's the population, protected from the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd, all those people out there. That's the progressive end of the spectrum. When you get to the more reactionary end, they're much harsher. I've, in writing about this, almost always kept to the progressive end, much more interesting. You can see how far things can go. But yes, that's the basis for the what used to be called the propaganda industry. You're not allowed to use that word anymore, the public relations industry. We have to make sure that the intelligent minority are protected from the mass of the population. That's Edward Bernays, the guru of the PR industry, one of the founders. And of course for their own good. Since they're going to do all sorts of stupid and ridiculous things, we have to treat them the way you treat a 3-year-old who's trying to run into the street. And that just goes back as far as you like. I mean, James Madison, the Constitution was based on that principle.
In a public talk in the Q&A sessions, in response to a question, which you often get, what can I do? You said, well, for starters, you can turn off your television. I thought it was an interesting comment that I'd like you to, flesh out a little bit. And then there's something that Tim Petersick, who's a professor of psychology at Ripon College in Wisconsin, he has written, there have been many studies which suggest that television increases violence, increases tribalization, shortens attention span, and lowers school performance among heavy viewers. And then he writes, I am concerned that watching television instead of reading tends to degrade the minds of heavy viewers so that they cannot think in abstractions such as cause and effect. In other words, the $100 billion spent on advertising each year has simply burned abstract reasoning out of their minds.
That could be. I don't know those studies, and I don't know that much about television. Actually, never watch it. But I had in mind something else. The fact that television just drums into your head certain fixed boundaries of thought. You know, a decent propaganda system does not announce its principles or intentions, certainly, the way, say, one of the reasons the old Soviet system was relatively ineffective, as far as we know, is it's too transparent. If you tell people this is what you have to think, then they understand that's what power wants us to think, and then they may find their way out of it. And in fact, there's studies that show a lot of them did. So, for example, according to Western studies, a substantial number of Russians that got their information from BBC or from Samizdat, equivalent of Z Magazine. That gave them a wider range of information and thinking than American television viewers have. Here, the doctrines are not formally stated, not you have to believe this. It's not the Catholic Church. You have to read this every day, say this every day. But it's just presupposed. You presuppose the framework, and then people just come to accept it. So that certainly does dull the mind. It's harder to extricate yourself from a system of unstated presuppositions than it is from explicitly stated doctrine. So yes, that's the way a good propaganda system will operate. And our system is highly sophisticated. A huge amount of effort and energy goes into it. The actors substantially understand what they're doing, it seems. Sometimes take, say, the 2008 election, which, like other elections, is a public relations extravaganza. But the advertising industry was very conscious of what they were doing. In fact, shortly after the election, they gave their annual prize for best marketing campaign of the year, and they gave it to the Obama campaign, meaning to themselves, the ones who organized the campaign. And there were actually discussion in the business press afterwards about the euphoria among executives over this achievement. They said it'll change the style in corporate boardrooms. Now we really know how to delude people better than we did before. Look at this achievement. They had no illusions, apparently, about a candidate who won office on the basis of his policies, his intentions, and so on. It was just a good marketing campaign, better than McCain's. Yeah.
States around the world are becoming obviously increasingly nervous about the internet and so-called social media, from China to Syria to the United States as well. There are increasingly calls for control, for censorship of the internet.
Well, right now there's a big battle going on between titans of industry over new proposed legislation. Google's been protesting. Google's one of the biggest corporations in the world, and they're protesting over a different thing, namely the property rights rules. So the movie industry, the record industry, and others, also big operators, want to restrain what they call piracy, taking their products without payment or agreement. And it is, if you like, it's piracy. It's the same kind of piracy that led to development in every rich and developed country. I mean, the United States, during its period of rapid growth, was carrying out what we now call piracy, to take a more efficient, advanced British technology. Britain did the same with countries that it was crushing, Ireland, the Low Countries, Belgium and so on, India, stole their more advanced technology. And now it's called piracy. It's the trade agreements imposed by the rich and powerful impose very heavy penalties against it. So intellectual property rights, so-called, are built into the World Trade Organization rules and other trade agreements with very stringent requirements. One of the most important is pharmaceuticals. It's to prevent countries with pharmaceutical industries like India from producing cheap drugs that will be available to the general population, undercutting the profits of major international corporations, and they're trying to prevent that.
How does the U.S. Square its trumpeting of free flow of information and democratic rights of expression with its response to WikiLeaks?
The profession of dedication to rights is always tinged with fundamental hypocrisy. Rights if we want them, not if we don't like them. And that's true of just about everything. Support for democracy, support for freedom of press, you pick and choose. Power systems, of course the U.S. government is one, they're not humanitarian organizations. Maybe individuals within them are actually committed to the rights, but as an institution, they're committed to the rights pretty much if and only if they benefit from them. I mean, the clearest example of this, which has been well studied, in fact, is support for democracy. It's pretty well established over many decades that the U.S. supports democracy if and only if it accords with strategic and economic objectives. Otherwise, it opposes it. And the U.S. is, of course, by no means alone on that. And the same is true of almost, say, terror, aggression, you pick it, torture, human rights, freedom of speech, whatever it may be. Now, we shouldn't overlook the fact that over the centuries, there has been an expansion of the sort of moral sphere in many ways, so that things are generally recognized now as rights, which wouldn't have been not very long ago. This includes recent examples, like, say, women's rights. And that affects policy choices, too. I mean, the people in, policy-making power, decision-making positions are not immune to the nature of the culture that they're part of. So there is a kind of a commitment to, say, human rights generally that there wasn't 50, 60 years ago, and that shows up sometimes in policy. Not very often if you look closely.
So you don't buy the line that this enormous trove of information that was leaked through, disseminated through WikiLeaks, was somehow compromising U.S. security or something along those lines?
I think it compromised the kind of security that governments are usually concerned about, their security from inspection by their own populations. I mean, I haven't read everything on WikiLeaks, but I'm sure there are people in power positions who are searching very hard to find some case where they can claim that there's been a harm to genuine security interests. And I don't know about you, but I haven't been able to see any and couldn't find any myself. But when governments talk about security, they're mostly concerned with their main enemy, which is their own population. If you look at declassified documents, this is one respect in which the U.S. is unusually free, not perfect, but by comparative standards, we have better access to internal government decisions than almost maybe any country that I know of. There's a regular declassification procedure, Freedom of Information Act functions to an extent, and there's fair access. I've spent a lot of time working through declassified documents, and most of them are just totally boring. You can read through volume after volume of foreign relations of the United States, and they find 3 sentences that are worth paying attention to. But if you look at them you find that these are all classified documents. The classified documents have little to do with genuine security, but a lot to do with preventing the population from knowing what you're up to. And I think that's been true of what I've seen of WikiLeaks too. So take the one example I mentioned, Ambassador Patterson's comments about Pakistan and the danger of the Bush-Obama policy of radicalizing and destabilizing a country with one of the biggest nuclear weapons programs in the world, in fact, one that's growing fast, and interlaced with jihadi elements. That's something for the population to know about, and that you have to keep from them. You have to put it in terms of defending ourselves from attack when you're, in fact, increasing the threat of attack. And that's true over and over again. Other interesting WikiLeaks exposures were at the time of the military coup in Honduras in 2009. The embassy in Honduras did carry out an extensive investigation to determine whether the coup was legal or whether it was illegal. And that was sent back to Washington, which means they knew about it, and discarded it, and after various steps ended up supporting the military coup, as we still do. Not in those words, but it's what it amounts to. Well, that's important for people to know about who want to understand Obama's thinking about freedom and democracy. But it's not the kind of thing the government wants you to know. Actually, some of the most interesting cases of WikiLeaks were not so much their exposures, but the way they were treated. Like some of the exposures were heralded as a wonderful event. For example, there were exposures reporting cables from, this is diplomatic cables. You don't know how accurate they are. Diplomats tend to report to the center what they know they want to hear, so you're already getting filtering. But there were cables from the Middle East embassies saying that the Arab dictators support U.S. policy on Iran. King of Saudi Arabia was quoted as saying, we've got to cut off their heads and so on. That was all over the place, headlines. And there were articles by leading commentators, remember Jacob Heilbrunn, Gideon Rachman in England, saying this is fantastic. It's as if the CIA is running WikiLeaks, and they should be congratulated for showing us how marvelous we are. The Arab dictators support us. Now, all of this was at the same time as polls were being released, U.S.-run polls, showing that the Arab populations are strongly against U.S. policy in Iran, so strongly against it that in, say, Egypt, about 80% of the population thought the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons, which they don't want them to have, but they're concerned with the real threats, the United States and Israel. That material was coming out at the same time. It barely published, but you could find it if you had the slightest interest in foreign affairs. So here we have applause for the fact that the dictators support us, silence about the fact that the population strongly oppose us, and that shows we're doing the right thing. Well, that tells you something about the commitment to democracy. Quite a lot, in fact. Here it's a matter of the reaction to the exposures, not the material in them.
There are indications that the WikiLeaks documents, the cables about the Ben Ali dictatorship in Tunisia, had a big influence on the revolt there.
Yeah, it's questionable. I mean, the leaks were interesting. They showed that the U.S. government, and France even more so, it's a French dependency, and France, I'm sure, French intelligence penetrates everything. It shows that they understood very well that Ben Ali was a harsh, corrupt dictator, that the population was strongly, very upset, strongly opposed to him. But that didn't affect support, not at all.
You mean support from Washington?
Western support, yeah, so the U.S. continued to support it, and particularly France. France, it was just outlandish. In fact, after the uprising had already started, you couldn't conceal it anymore. One cabinet minister in France went to Tunisia for her vacation. This is a place that's under the thumb of France for a long time and surely penetrated by French intelligence. But whether these leaks, how much they influence the protests is an open question. I kind of doubt that Tunisians cared very much about French and U.S. hypocrisy, which is all that they revealed. Nothing that they didn't know themselves.
Dan Ellsberg and Bradley Manning.
Dan's an old friend. I was involved with him in helping release the Pentagon Papers, which I thought was a quite proper thing to do, and could talk about that and testified at his trial and so on. But in the case of Bradley Manning, he's charged with having released material to Julian Assange, who distributed on WikiLeaks, and he's been in prison now for, I think, about a year and a half, a large part of that in solitary confinement, which is essentially torture. It is torture, and treated pretty in rotten ways, been bitterly attacked. There used to be a principle in Anglo-American law, if you go back 8 centuries to the Magna Carta, saying that there's a presumption of innocence. You're innocent until you're proved guilty, and you must have a right to a speedy trial. It wasn't all stated that way in the Magna Carta, but in what followed from it, those principles developed. They're in the U.S. Constitution. They've been thrown out the window totally. Here's someone who is charged with something which, in my opinion, wouldn't be a crime in the first place. It'd be a service to the country. Well, I think he should be applauded, but the government should be harshly condemned for throwing out this is not the only case or even the worst case, throwing out basic principles of law and human rights that we technically have accepted for a long time. In fact, they're considered, you read articles in law journals, they're considered part of the jewels of Anglo-American civilization. Yeah, we're throwing them out.
Well, didn't Obama, a constitutional law professor, make a comment about Bradley Manning?
Yeah, right away. He said he's guilty. That's unconscionable. Even if he wasn't a constitutional lawyer, you know that the president doesn't say that about a person who's charged with something without evidence. I mean, there are worse things, like, say, assassinating Osama bin Laden. He wasn't tried in a court. He's innocent until proven guilty. So you assassinate him if you don't like him.
Awlaki in Yemen, an American citizen.
Another case, that got a little attention because he's an American citizen. Or the case yesterday of the drone attack, which apparently killed an alleged leader in Al-Qaeda. Well, maybe he's guilty of something, maybe not. But if, say, Iranian terrorists killed, somebody, say, Panetta, the defense secretary, tomorrow, saying, well, he's involved in planning attacks against Iran, which he is, would we think that's okay?
I know you well know, I shouldn't say but during the Bush period, liberals were in high dudgeon over putative war crimes and these kinds of assassinations, but have been relatively muted during the Obama period.
Yeah, they have. I mean, some keep talking, but not many. And Obama has made it clear that nobody's going to be punished, which is quite understandable. If people were punished for war crimes in the Bush period, then he'd be punished for similar crimes today. That's what the headlines ought to be saying.
That brings me to a comment that you made years back, that every president since 1945 is a war criminal, could be tried for war crimes. Is that, are you still kind of holding to that?
Well, I think I was pretty careful about it. I said, by the principles of Nuremberg, that would be a fair statement, not by the practice of Nuremberg, because the practice departed sharply from the principles.
The principle being the planning and waging of aggressive war is the supreme international war crime.
And many other. That was the primary charge, but there were many others. So, for example, the German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, counterpart to Colin Powell, he was hanged. And one of the main charges against him was that he either permitted or sort of was complicit in a preemptive strike against Norway. Well, Norway really posed a threat to Germany. I mean, the British were there. They were planning an attack. He was not accused of, having gone to some international institution and producing fabricated stories calling for an attack on Iraq, where there was no threat at all. In fact, not even a remote threat, even if you believe their claims. And if you go step by step, it's pretty much the same way. So those are the principles of Nuremberg. But of course, the practice was quite different. In fact, the Nuremberg Tribunal was the most authentic and significant, I think, of any of the tribunals that have taken place. But it had fundamental flaws, really deep flaws, and they were known to the prosecutors. For example, Telford Taylor commented on them right away. Effectively, they defined war crimes as something you did and we didn't do. So that was the criterion. So, for example, bombing of civilian concentrations, urban bombing, was not considered a war crime because the Allies did much more of it than the Axis. In fact, there were particular defendants, like German Admiral Dönitz, who was able to reject the charges, and the tribunal accepted it because he got testimony from the British Admiralty and from the American Navy saying we did the same thing. So that therefore it isn't a war crime.
One of the things that you say about yourself, which often stuns people, is that you're an old-fashioned conservative. And what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, I think the Magna Carta made some sense and the whole legal tradition that grew out of it. So I think there are really important things in what I mentioned before, the expansion of the moral horizon, including in particular legal instantiations of it that have taken place over the centuries, particularly since the Enlightenment. I think we should hold on to those ideals. There's plenty wrong with them. So you don't hold on to slavery, which was also part of it. But there's improvements as well. And that's, somebody's a conservative, at least as I understand the term, used to be understood to be somebody who cares about traditional values. And these are traditional values which I think are regularly being thrown out the window. We should condemn that.
So how did you get this moniker of being a kind of wild-eyed radical?
Because holding on to traditional values is a very radical position. It threatens and undermines power.
Another statement that you make that sometimes makes people gasp is Nixon was the last liberal president of the United States. The evidence for that?
I'm not saying I liked Nixon. I think he was a horrible person and a terrible cynic. But if you look at his record, he was the last president to have carried forward the process of liberal legislation that began with the New Deal, picked up again in the 1960s, and ended with Nixon. The things that the Republicans in Congress are now trying to dismantle, many of them are Nixon initiatives.
Like Clean Air Act, things like that.
Environmental Protection Agency, the Earned Income Tax Credit, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health principles. In fact, there's a list of what are called liberal legislations, expansions of steps that had been taken slowly from the New Deal on through the Great Society, and pretty much end up with Nixon.
Yeah, he also proposed a guaranteed income, which he was unable to get that through.
That comes from the conservative economists like Milton Friedman. negative income tax, things like that. I mean, it got through in some form, like the earned income tax credit, but not as broad as they were talking about. And yeah, these are progressive steps.
You're listening to Noam Chomsky, Unconventional Wisdom, part 2 of a special 2-part program. This is Alternative Radio. You can order copies of this program as well as the book How the World Works by calling our toll-free number 1-800-444-1977. That's 1-800-444-1977. Or you can order online on our website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org. A perennial question that you get at your talks is, well, there's an election coming up, Professor Chomsky, what should I do? Should I vote? Should I stay at home?
Well, first point is I think you should spend about 5 minutes on the question. There are much more important questions, like what should I be doing to try to change the country and so on. But this is a question, and I think it doesn't take much thought, in my opinion. If there's an election, when we get to the presidential election, let's put aside the primaries, you're going to have a small range of choices. There'll be 2 candidates, neither of whom you like. One will be plausibly much more dangerous than the other. If you're in a safe state, you know how it's going to come out, you have choices. You can say, okay, I won't vote, or I'll vote for some party that's trying to become an independent alternative, say the Greens. I'll do that. If you're in a swing state, you have to ask yourself, do I want to help the worst candidate be elected? Or do I want to prevent that? Well, it doesn't mean you like the other candidate, but that's in fact the choice. So you have to ask, is it better to help the worst candidate to be elected, which you can make a case for, because, in fact, there's an old Communist Party principle back from the early 30s called the worse the better. If you get the worst candidate in, it's going to be better because then there'll be more support for a revolution. That was for Germany. We know where that one led. But it's a question you have to think about, but I don't think you have to think about very hard.
Do you think the Occupy Wall Street movement should be involved in electoral politics or as act from below without engaging in the system?
As they stand, they're not an electoral force. First of all, I don't think they can take a unified position. They have no mechanism for making a unified decision, which I think is a good thing. It's better to have a variety of opinions and attitudes and interchange and interaction about what to do, and in fact, to accept and to tolerate opposing opinions within the general framework. That's generally good. They can change the character of what's happening in the country to an extent they already have. And I think that's much more important than having a General Assembly vote and saying, we support X.
What do you think some practical steps that the movement can effect?
They've already undertaken practical steps. So, for example, the general discourse in the country has substantially changed. There's now overt concern and engagement in questions of, say, inequality, of the extraordinary power of the financial institutions, of government subordination to the financial institutions, of the role of finance of money in general in buying and shaping elections, of decisions by corporate executives to undermine domestic manufacturing and employment so as to improve their balance. All of those things are there's a whole list of them. They're very important. They can go beyond that, and to some extent have. So, for example, they can open the question of, just take the last point, why should it be up to executives and managers to decide to settle investment decisions about where things will be produced, what will be produced, how profits will be distributed, and so on. Why should that be the domain of the directorate of a corporation? Usually banks, a small sector of rich people, and so on. Do they have some right to make those decisions? Not by any economic principle. In fact, there's every reason to advocate those decisions being made by what are called stakeholders, communities, workforce, others affected by the decisions. That's not a particularly radical position, incidentally. It's a position advocated in standard texts on business economics. You could be at least that imaginative. And that would have a major impact on the nature of the society and the economy if it's pursued. And there's a certain amount of so-called conservative support from it. Actually, that's one of the things that Garel Perovitz discusses in his recent book on America After Capitalism. So these are all quite straightforward things, like a financial transaction tax, as they have in many countries and as would be very effective here. These are quite practical things that can be put through. And I think so they range from short-term practical proposals to much more long-term objectives that we can take steps towards realizing and putting on the agenda. The Occupy movements have done a pretty good job on this, I think.
But going forward, how are they going to be able to sustain themselves in the face of this propaganda system and an increasingly repressive police force? One of the things that a number of people have commented on has been the degree of militarization of local police departments. They're looking more and more like special operations forces.
Yeah. Well, there's a principle which is power doesn't commit suicide. So yeah, there'll be attempts to carry out repression. I mean, the repression that exists now is not remotely like it's been in the past. I mean, there's nothing like Wilson's Red Scare. There's nothing like COINTELPRO, as far as we're aware. There's no assassinations of leaders and so on. But yeah, it'll be repressive. And some of the tactics that are used, which are good tactics, lend themselves easily to police repression. So occupying a space, which was a very good tactic, and I think good that they do it, but you have to recognize that that provides an opening to police repression, which in fact will be publicly supported to a large extent. So you have to find other tactics. And the way to deal with the kind of repression that will take place and the denigration and so on is just to build more popular support. I mean, what the Occupy movements have to do, if they're going to sustain themselves, is recognize that tactics are not strategies. And a tactic may be a very good one, but tactics tend to have diminishing returns. After a while, people get tired of them, they lose their efficacy, you have to move on. And what I think it's generally accepted in the movements that what they have to do is reach out and engage other sectors of the society. There have been moves in that direction, like the Occupy the Hood actions, the joining with anti-foreclosure movements. Just a couple of days ago, the first step, I don't know, I hope it'll go on, in bringing together the old civil rights movement and the Occupy movements. This was initiated by Ben Davis, an old civil rights activist and Occupy Wall Street activist. There was a demonstration in Washington, which is kind of a first step. If that goes on, that brings together other segments of the population. It's got to work into the labor force somehow. That's very significant. It's hard to think of a popular movement that got anywhere if it didn't have an active labor participant. And maybe not the labor leadership, but at least rank and file participation. It was true of the background to the New Deal in the 30s. It's true of the the Arab Spring movements that the Occupy movement here takes as a kind of an inspiration, the strong labor movement participation. And you look over time, that you can't be avoided, and it's difficult now.
But that didn't hold true in the 60s when organized labor was broken off from the peace movement.
Yeah, because the peace movement was not directing its activities against institutional structure. It was directing them against particular policies, like repressing civil rights, fighting a foreign war, a couple of other things like that. As soon as it began raising class issues, it was quickly marginalized and repressed. Actually, Martin Luther King is the clearest example of that. I suppose we've talked about it, yeah.
The fate of the species, a topic of some interest, one would think. You say systemic risk in the financial system can be remedied by the taxpayer, but no one will come to the rescue if the environment is destroyed. That it must be destroyed is close to an institutional imperative. Again, something that might stun people, an institutional imperative to destroy the environment.
Well, it's an institutional imperative. By imperative, I don't say it's a law of nature, you can change it, but given the way institutions now function, one critical element is that the decision makers, the core decision makers in the economy and the society, and therefore indirectly in the political system, their core goal is to essentially maximize short-term profit and power. And that leads almost directly to destruction of the environment. In fact, we can see it right in front of us. The threat to destruction of the environment is quite serious. So just within the last couple of months, the major agencies which monitor emissions, global emissions, have released very ominous predictions. International Energy Association released data which they concluded, their own chief economists and so on, concluded give us maybe 5 more years before we reach a turning point that will be irreversible.
The words exactly from the chief economist. The door is closing. I am very worried. Yeah. If we don't change direction now on how we use energy, we will end up beyond what scientists tell us is the minimum for safety. The door will be closed forever.
Yeah, that's a pretty conservative agency. That's not a bunch of radicals. In fact, it was formed by the initiative of Henry Kissinger. The U.S. Also has an annual emissions report, Department of Energy, and they, I think maybe a week or so before that, shortly before, came out with their report for 2010, which they said was the highest rise in emissions on record. And their commentators pointed out, that they're specialists, that the estimate that they're now making now is worse than the worst case scenario of the IPCC, the International Commission. Actually, there was I didn't see much news reporting about it, but one of the few news reports quoted one of the MIT faculty members, who's one of the leading investigators of the MIT climate change program. They've got a big program here. He said, yeah, that's true. We've been saying for years that the IPCC estimates are, the consensus is much too conservative. That in fact it's our models, some of which they've published, show that it's much more dangerous than that. And if we don't do something very quickly about fossil fuels, we're going to be over the edge. This is not coming from far out radicals. These are the major institutions, leading scientists. And in fact, it's kind of interesting to watch the way this is all discussed in the media. I mean, it's usually a kind of a he says, she says sort of thing. Like on the one hand, you have the IPCC On the other hand, you have a fringe of scientists and a couple of senators who say we don't believe any of it, and that's the choice. Actually, there's a third set of scientists who almost never make it into print. That's much larger than the fringe of denialists, like the ones who run the MIT program, who say, or the chief economist of the International Energy Association, who say that the consensus is much too conservative. It's much worse than that. They don't get reported. And the public is left with a choice between two positions, which they're in no position to make a judgment about. And then on top of that is a huge propaganda offensive coming from the business sector saying don't believe any of it, none of it's real. And this is true, a little to my surprise, even of the more serious and responsible parts of the business press, like the London Financial Times, maybe the best newspaper in the world, the most serious and responsible. Just at the time that these emissions reports were coming out, including the one you quoted, they devoted a full page to a euphoric description of the possibility that the United States might have a century of energy independence ahead of it, and they added a century of global hegemony, which will come from that by use of new techniques of extracting fossil fuels from shale rock, tar sands, and so on. Well, there's debate about whether they're right or not. Will there be a century of energy independence? But the idea of hailing a century of energy independence by, saturating the global environment with fossil fuels, which may be destroying us in 5 years, that's pretty amazing. Forgetting, the details about whether they're right or wrong. Celebrating this is saying, fine, let's commit suicide. There's the institutionals, and this is, I'm sure the people who wrote that article read the same reports and take them seriously, but in their institutional role, they act in a different framework, and that makes it a kind of a social, cultural necessity, not a point of logic. You could make different decisions, but that would require real rethinking of the nature of institutions.
Mark Herskard, writing in The Nation, says that 2 degrees Celsius is the absolute maximum temperature rise that can be allowed if there's to be any chance of avoiding catastrophe and potentially irreversible climate change. The deal made in Durban was the site of an international conference on climate change in December of 2011. The deal in Durban has a 0 chance of meeting the 2 centigrade Celsius, of meeting the 2 Celsius target.
Yeah, he's reporting the IPCC estimates, and in fact those of the commentary that we've just been quoting. It's been the 2 degrees centigrade level has been regarded as about the level of global warming at which you can expect essentially decent survival. If you're over that, you may be over the edge. And it's true that the Durban proposals get nowhere near that.
And talking about propaganda and what's called astroturfing carried out by corporations, many of them heavily invested in the energy sector. Naomi Klein, writing in The Nation, a 2007 Harris poll found that 71% of Americans believe that the continued burning of fossil fuels would cause the climate to change. That's in 2007. By 2009, the figure had dropped to 51%. In June 2011, the number of Americans who agreed was down to 44%, well under half the population. According to Scott Keeter, who's a director of survey research at the Pew Research Center, he says, this is among the largest shifts over a short period of time seen in recent public opinion history. So again, the propaganda barrage has been fairly effective.
Yeah, there's still a significant majority of Americans who think it's a serious problem. But it's true that it has declined, and the Pew polls are quite interesting in that they're international polls, and they show that internationally there's very strong concern, and the United States is not totally off the spectrum, but it's off at the edge of the spectrum. Concern in the United States is notably less than in comparable countries. And the drop that she's describing is exactly what they report. And it's very hard to doubt that that's connected with the propaganda campaign that has been quite openly conducted. In fact, a couple of years ago, right after the essentially the insurance company victories on the Health Reform Act, the so-called Obamacare, right after that, you can read a report in the New York Times citing leaders of the Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, saying, we're going to take our victory in that campaign as a model, and we're going to use it to try to undermine concern about global warming. When you get to, say, the Republican debates, I mean, even to mention global warming is to essentially commit suicide. And some of the people take remarkable positions, like take Ron Paul, who appeals to a lot of progressives. It's very hard to find a straight statement on his webpage, but the only ones I've found are things like, global warming is one of the biggest hoaxes of the modern period. He doesn't provide any argument or evidence as to why he disregards the scientific consensus, just I say so, period. Well, with that kind of attitude, you really are approaching the edge. And in fact, actions are being taken to implement those views. So first of all, Congress is doing very little, but the Republicans in the Congress are trying hard to dismantle the few regulations and controls that do exist. A sign of the shift of the nature of the kind of elite discourse in the last years is that the Republicans in Congress are now trying to dismantle what Nixon instituted. Nixon would look like a radical today, Eisenhower like a super radical.
Nevertheless, the struggle continues, la lucha continue, as it was once said, and that keeps you going.
Yeah. I mean, the lemmings may be going over the cliff, but they haven't fallen off yet. So, of course, you continue. And there's a lot of positive things, too. Like the Occupy movements, which you mentioned. It's a positive sign, and there are many others.
2012 marks the 100th anniversary of something that happened not very far from here in Lawrence, Massachusetts, the Bread and Roses strike, and Steve Early's got an article about it in these times. There was an example of largely immigrant workers, many of them women and children, overcoming tremendous odds to achieve some semblance of decency and justice.
That's right. And it's interesting to remember the slogan. Bread and Roses meant we not only want bread for our children, we want dignity and honorable life. So you're not going to satisfy us just with wages. We have to have the roses too. That's a crucial demand, kind of sacrificed by the labor leadership, but never very far from the consciousness of people. It's shown up over time repeatedly. The Lordstown strike in the early 70s, which had a lot of young workers, many of them coming out of a kind of a 60s cultural background. Very important strike, which called for bread and roses. We want dignity. We want control of the workplace. We want to be treated like human beings, not just enough wages to get bread with.
Thanks very much for your time.
Yeah.
That was Noam Chomsky, Unconventional Wisdom, Part 2 of a special two-part program. I talked with him in his office at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Noam Chomsky has been a leading voice for peace and social justice for many decades. He's the author of scores of books, including a collection of interviews I did with him called How the World Works. This program is produced by Alternative Radio, an unembedded award-winning weekly series based in Boulder, Colorado. Since we began broadcasting in 1986, we've always offered AR free to all public and community radio stations in the United States and the rest of the world. AR is independent. We feature such voices as Angela Davis, Bill McKibben, Richard Wolff, Arundhati Roy, Chris Hedges, and Tariq Ali. And since its inception, Alternative Radio has made a special effort to record Noam Chomsky. To access our vast audio catalog, including the Chomsky Archive with hundreds of recordings and many books, and to find out about subscribing to AR, just go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Again, our website where we are podcasting, alternativeradio.org. To place a credit card order for CDs, MP3s, or written transcripts of Noam Chomsky, Unconventional Wisdom, a special two-part program, and the book How the World Works, call us toll-free at 1-800-444-1977. Again, that toll-free number is 1-800-444-1977. Or you can order on our secure website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org. Series theme music is performed by the Kronos Quartet from Pieces of Africa. Joe Ritchie is our editor. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.